Hi everyone. I'm very happy to present our work on the optimality of optimistic responsiveness. This is a joint work with Kartik, Ittai, and Ling. Uh, in this work, we are interested in understanding the optimal latency of an optimistically responsive synchronous protocol, and we provide a lower bound on latencies for such an optimistically responsive protocol. So we then provide two matching upper bound protocols that achieve this optimality. So to begin with the basics, let us consider a state machine replication protocol. Over here, client issue command to a server which maintains a state machine. The server maintains a log of commands and execute these commands on the state machine. Once the server crashes or performs some arbitrary actions, the consistent service provided by the system is no longer available. So to address this issue, we replicate the state machine on a group of servers. The group of server must act as a single non-faulty server and must provide a consistent interface despite some nodes failing either by crashing or performing arbitrary actions. The servers here execute a consensus protocol that provide following guarantees such as safety and liveness. So safety here means that nothing bad should ever happen, and, and the non-faulty replicas must always agree on the same sequence of commands. And liveness here means something good should eventually happen, and the command issued by the clients must eventually be committed by the non-faulty servers. So in this work, what we are interested is in the latency of such commits. And whenever we talk about latencies of a consensus protocol, it depends on the underlying communication model. The basic communication models that are generally considered are synchrony model, where messages sent at time t are delivered by time t plus of big delta, where big delta is a pessimistic network delay. And the other models are partially synchronous or asynchronous models, where messages sent are eventually delivered. So generally speaking, the protocols designed under synchrony assumption have higher fault tolerance, and they can tolerate up to minority failures. On the other hand, partially synchronous or asynchronous protocols can tolerate only up to 33% of the failures. However, these partially synchronous or asynchronous protocols can commit responsibly, and the commit latency of such protocols depends on the actual network delay, small delta. On the flip side, the latency of synchronous protocols depend on the pessimistic network delay delta, which can be much larger than the actual network delay, small delta. So what this means is that synchronous protocols cannot commit faster, even though messages may arrive fast. So recent synchronous protocols such as Sync stuff have been trying to reduce the reliance on this big delta. However, due to a recent lower bound that says the latency of a protocol that tolerates more than 1/3 failure must depend on delta. Otherwise, the protocol is no longer synchronous, and we know that partial synchronous or asynchronous protocols are subject to tolerating up to 1/3 failures. So the natural question then is to ask if we can allow synchronous protocols to commit responsibly when certain optimistic conditions are met. So this question was recently answered by a recent work, Thunderella, and they introduced the notion of optimistic responsiveness to achieve this. So Thunderella is a synchronous protocol that tolerates minority corruption, and it allows replicas to commit responsibly when certain optimistic conditions are met. Here, the optimistic conditions are the leader is honest, and 76% of the replicas are honest. And when the optimistic conditions are not met, the protocol commits in slow synchronous path, and the commit latency depends on the big delta. So the Thunderella has this notion of slow path and fast path, where the system usually starts in the slow path with synchronous commit. When optimistic conditions are met, the protocol makes an explicit switch to the fast path, where replicas commit responsibly. So over here, the replicas need to agree on which path to commit in, and they together move to that path. When the fast path fails to make progress, the protocol falls back to a slow synchronous mode using an intermediary transition phase which incurs some switching latency. So this switching to the slow part incurs some switching latency in between. So while this paradigm allows replicas to commit responsibly under some optimistic condition, this strategy in fact has several issues. First, it is hard to know whether optimistic conditions are met or not. So it is possible that optimistic conditions were met earlier, but the protocol is still in the slow path. Thus, we cannot commit responsibly. On the other hand, if we hastily move to the fast path and it turns out that the optimistic conditions are not met, uh, then we'll have to fall back to the slow synchronous mode, and this will incur some switching latency in between. Second, an adversary under minority corruption may attack this strategy and worsen overall commit latency. For example, when a protocol is in the slow path, the Byzantine replicas uh, may respond quickly and trigger fast path. And once in the fast path, they stop responding completely. So this is going to force an explicit switch to the slow path using intermediary transition phase, and it's going to incur switching latency. As a result, the overall latency of the protocol is going to be worse than a protocol with a single slow path. So to address this issue, we are trying to propose protocols that allows both of these commit paths to be active simultaneously and allow replicas to commit with the best possible latency. But before that, we need to understand what is the optimal latency of an optimistically responsive protocol that allows both of these commit paths to be active simultaneously. So we answer this by providing a lower bound on the latency of an optimistically responsive protocol. In the interest of time, I will not be going through the lower bound in detail. At a high level, our lower bound says that there does not exist a consensus protocol with two commit paths. The first is the optimistic path that commits with a latency of order small delta and tolerates at least one fault. And we claim that this commit path does not exist or cannot exist in conjunction with a synchronous commit that commits with a latency of 2 delta, 2 big deltas minus order small deltas, where the synchronous commit path tolerates at least minority corruption. So what this means is that if the sum of the latencies between the commit parts is less than 2 delta, I can always find some executions where the optimistic commit path and the synchronous commit, these two commit parts will basically commit conflicting values. Thus, the sum of the latency of between these paths must be greater than or equals to 2 big deltas. Now that we have seen the optimal latency of an optimistically responsive protocol, let us look at an upper bound result that achieves this optimal latency. So our upper bound result says that there exists a consensus protocol that tolerates a minority corruption and also supports the commit parts where the optimistic commit uh, commits with a latency of just 2 small deltas and tolerates 24% of the failures or requires 76% of the replicas to be honest. And this exists in conjunction with a synchronous commit with a latency of 2 big deltas plus order small delta and tolerates a minority corruption. So this protocol is optimal due to following reasons. First, the sum of the latency between these optimistic commit and the synchronous commit paths is just 2 big deltas, ignoring the order small delta terms. And this is optimal due to the lower bound that we just saw. Next, the optimistic path requires only 76% of the replicas to be honest. And this is optimal due to a recent lower bound presented by Thunderella. Third, our optimistic commit latency incurs just a latency of 2 small deltas. So this is optimal due to the lower bound presented by Dolev, Ristrunk, and Strong. Next, let me present a high-level overview of just a steady-state phase of our protocol in state machine replication setting. So over here, there is a designated proposer called leader that proposes a value to all the replicas. Upon receiving the first valid proposal, the replicas simply forwards the proposal and votes for it. So next, the replicas can commit using either of the commit rule, whichever is triggered first. The optimistic commit rule is triggered when a replica receives 76% of the ports and does not hear any bad events. So over here, the bad events means the replica does not hear any equivocating or conflicting proposal from the leader. And this 76% says ports for a value, we call that as a responsive certificate. Similarly, the synchronous rule is triggered if a replica ports for a value and sees no any equivocation within 2 delta time after it ports. And we ensure that if a replica waits 2 delta time, it receives at least f+1 ports, and this f+1 ports is called a synchronous certificate. So let us take a look at why these commit rules are safe. And two honest replicas R and R prime can never commit on conflicting values B and B prime using either of the commit rules. First, R and R prime cannot both commit responsibly. So this is true because of the quorum intersection argument. So what this means is that if there exists 76% ports for a value B, suppose B, then there cannot exist a 76% ports for a conflicting value B prime. Second, R and R prime cannot both commit synchronously. Note that in the synchronous part, a replica waits for at least 2 delta before it commits. So if there exists an equivocation, they must hear an equivocation during this time, and they will not commit. Third, it's quite possible that replica R commits responsively and replica R prime commits synchronously. However, this is not possible because if replica R committed responsibly at some time t, then there must not have been an equivocating proposal before time t minus of delta. So why is this true is that if there exists an equivocating proposal before t minus of delta, replica R must have heard of the equivocation by time t due to the synchrony assumption, and it would not commit. Second, the earliest time some replica R prime could have ported for a conflicting value B prime is between t minus delta and t. Let's call that that as t prime. However, at least one replica that ported for B must have forwarded that port to all on honest replica, including replica R prime. Thus, replica R prime must have heard of value B before its 2 delta timer expires. Thus, replica R prime would not commit a conflicting value. So, while this explanation suffices to argue why two conflicting values cannot be committed at the same height, in a state machine replication setting, replicas keep porting and committing new values by extending on previously committed commands or values, thus forming a chain of values. At this point, we should note that although two responsive certificates cannot exist for conflicting values, there can be a responsive and a synchronous certificate for conflicting values. As a result, there could be conflicting chains. For example, within a view, there could be a chain containing responsive sort and a conflicting chain containing only synchronous sort certificates. And this chain containing the synchronous certificate may be higher than the chain containing the responsive certificate. However, as we just saw that if there exists a responsive certificate, a synchronous commit is not possible. Thus, in this case, we rank the chains and select the chain that extends from the responsive certificate. Similarly, our synchronous commit rule ensures that there cannot be an equivocation. Thus, if there exists an equivocation, either of the chains could not have been committed. For simplicity, we always choose the longest chain. So to ensure safety across views when changing the leader, we always ensure that the honest leader always receives the highest preferred chain before it starts proposing in the new view. And we also ensure that all honest replica also receives this highest preferred chain before it can port in the new view. Thus, if there exists a conflicting chain in the lower view, it must mean that they have been withheld by the Byzantine replicas. Thus, we always choose the chain containing a certificate in the higher view, although the chains in the lower view may be longer or may contain a responsive certificate. Uh, because our protocol was simple and optimal, we implemented it and evaluated its performance against state-of-the-art protocols such as hot stuff, which is a partially synchronous protocol, and sync hot stuff, which is a synchronous protocol. And under optimistic conditions, our protocol performs significantly better than other protocols uh, because our protocol requires a single round of porting, while hot stuff requires at least 3 rounds of porting before it commits a value. Thus, as we can see that this red line is the latency of our protocol. Here we have called our protocol as OpSync, and we can see that it performs consistently better than hot stuff, which is the yellow line. And because sync hot stuff is a synchronous protocol, its commit latency depends on this big delta. And our protocol would perform similar to this sync hot stuff if optimistic conditions were not met. Uh, Next, let me provide another upper bound result that we have. So in the lower bound that we saw, the lower bound holds only when the optimistic commit tolerates at least a single fault. So it turns out that if our optimistic commit does not tolerate commit path does not tolerate any faults, or requires all the replicas to be honest, uh, we can allow a synchronous commit that commits with a latency of just uh, uh, one big delta plus some small delta terms. So thus our second upper bound result protocol allows having two commit paths where the optimistic commit commits with a latency of just two small deltas and does not tolerate any failures, and the synchronous path commits with a latency of delta plus of order delta, small delta, and tolerates a minority corruption. And this protocol is still optimal. It's optimal because the synchronous commit latency is just delta plus of order delta, and this is optimal due to a recent lower bound. Second, our optimistic commit latency is just two small deltas, and this is again optimal due to the lower bound by Dolev, Ristrunk, and Strong. So with this, I would like to conclude. Thank you.